Lonely widower adopts stray dog. What he finds in her shed will leave him speechless. The old rocking chair creaked rhythmically on the porch, a lonely counterpoint to the chirping of crickets in the fading summer twilight. George Miller, his weathered hands clasped around a steaming mug of chamomile tea, watched the fireflies blink to life in the deepening shadows of his backyard. It was a familiar scene, one he'd shared countless times with his beloved Martha, her laughter mingling with the night sounds, her hand warm in his. But now, the chair beside him was empty, the laughter a fading echo in his memory. Martha had been gone 6 months, taken swiftly by a heart attack that left George reeling in a world suddenly devoid of color and warmth. The house, once filled with the comforting aroma of her baking and the cheerful clutter of her hobbies, now echoed with an unsettling silence. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to mock him with its relentless reminder of passing time. George sighed, the weight of his loneliness settling heavily on his chest. He missed her terribly, her gentle smile, her infectious laugh, the way she could always find the silver lining in any cloud. He missed their morning coffee rituals, their evening strolls hand in hand, their whispered conversations late into the night. He even missed her gentle chiding when he left his socks on the living room floor. Retirement, once a golden promise of shared adventures and lazy afternoons, had become a desolate expanse of empty hours. He tried to fill the void with crossword puzzles, gardening, and the occasional fishing trip, but nothing seemed to ease the ache in his heart. His children, bless their souls, called regularly and visited when they could, but they had their own lives, their own families. He couldn't expect them to fill the gaping hole Martha had left behind. As darkness enveloped the small Maine town of Havenwood, George retreated indoors, the chill of the evening mirroring the coldness that had settled around his heart. He ate a microwave dinner, the tasteless meal a stark contrast to Martha's home-cooked feasts. Afterward, he settled into his armchair, the television flickering with a mindless sitcom that failed to hold his attention. He glanced at Martha's favorite armchair, its floral upholstery faded with time, a crocheted blanket draped over the armrest. A wave of grief washed over him, so intense it almost took his breath away. He closed his eyes, picturing her sitting there, a book in her lap, her silver hair catching the lamplight. "Oh, Martha," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "How do I go on without you?" The only answer was the relentless ticking of the clock, a stark reminder that time marched on, indifferent to his sorrow. He felt adrift in a sea of loneliness, with no land in sight. Just then, a news bulletin flashed across the screen, interrupting his somber reverie. A grainy image of a police car and a dog caught his attention. The news anchor's voice, filled with a mix of disbelief and horror, spoke of a disturbing discovery and an act of animal cruelty. George, usually indifferent to the nightly news, found himself strangely drawn to the story. Little did he know, this news report would be the first ripple in the calm waters of his solitary existence, a ripple that would soon grow into a wave, carrying him towards an unexpected shore. Officer Mike Thompson had seen a lot in his 20 years on the Havenwood police force, but nothing quite prepared him for the sight that greeted him that warm August evening. He was on a routine patrol, cruising down a quiet residential street lined with neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences, when a scruffy, mud-caked dog suddenly darted into the road, barking frantically and almost colliding with his patrol car. Mike slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. He cursed under his breath, expecting to see a reckless driver or a child chasing a ball. But there was nothing, just the dog, a mixed breed with pleading eyes and a whimper that tugged at his heartstrings. The dog, a female with matted fur and visible ribs, stood directly in front of his car, refusing to budge. She barked again, a desperate, almost human sound, and then turned and ran a few yards, looking back at Mike as if urging him to follow. Intrigued and a little unnerved, Mike cautiously followed the dog. She led him down a narrow alley, past overflowing trash cans and overgrown weeds, her barks becoming more insistent with each step. The stench of decay grew stronger, making Mike wrinkle his nose. Finally, the dog stopped in front of a dilapidated shed, its wooden door hanging precariously by one hinge. The whimpering had stopped, replaced by a low growl that sent shivers down Mike's spine. He drew his flashlight and cautiously pushed the door open. The scene inside made his blood run cold. In the dim light, he saw another dog, emaciated and barely conscious, chained to a wall. The chain was so short the dog couldn't even lie down. A pool of stagnant water lay nearby, the only source of drink in the sweltering heat. The air was thick with the smell of urine and feces. Mike felt a surge of anger and disgust. He immediately radioed for backup and animal control. As he waited, he knelt beside the chained dog, his heart aching at its suffering. The dog's eyes, dull and lifeless, met his with a look of utter despair. "Don't worry, fella," Mike whispered, gently stroking the dog's matted fur. "We're gonna get you out of here." When the animal control officers arrived, they were equally appalled by the conditions. They carefully freed the chained dog and examined both animals, their faces grim. The stray that had led Mike to the shed was malnourished and dehydrated, but otherwise okay. The chained dog, however, was in critical condition. "He's been neglected for a long time," one of the officers said, shaking his head. "Might not make it." Mike felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He watched as they carefully loaded the dogs into their van, the chained dog whimpering softly. He couldn't shake the image of those despairing eyes, the embodiment of suffering and helplessness. Back in his patrol car, Mike replayed the events of the evening. He couldn't believe someone could be so cruel. He thought about the stray, her desperate plea for help, her unwavering loyalty to her companion. He knew he wouldn't be able to rest until he knew both dogs were safe. He decided to visit the animal shelter the next day, hoping to learn more about their condition. He also made a mental note to contact the local news. This story needed to be told. He wanted the whole town to know about the heroic act of a stray dog who had saved another from certain death. The Havenwood Animal Shelter was a modest building on the outskirts of town, painted in cheerful yellows and blues that belied the sadness often found within its walls. George had driven past it countless times, but he'd never ventured inside. Animals, especially dogs, had always been Martha's domain. She had a natural affinity for them, a way of communicating that transcended words. George, on the other hand, preferred the predictable companionship of his pipe and a good book. But the news report had stirred something within him, a flicker of empathy for the two dogs and their harrowing ordeal. He felt compelled to see them, to offer some small comfort, perhaps even a donation. He parked his old Ford pickup in the near-empty lot and walked towards the entrance, his steps hesitant at first, then growing more purposeful. The shelter was bustling with activity. Volunteers bustled between cages, cleaning, feeding, and playing with the animals. The air was filled with a cacophony of barks, meows, and chirps, a symphony of life that both intrigued and overwhelmed George. He approached the reception desk, where a young woman with kind eyes and a warm smile greeted him. "Welcome to Havenwood Animal Shelter," she said. "Can I help you?" I saw the news report about the two dogs," George stammered, feeling a bit out of place. "The ones found in the shed." "Oh, yes," the woman said, her smile fading slightly. "They're here. The stray is doing well, but the other one, he's still critical. We've named him Chance." "Chance," George repeated, the name echoing the dog's precarious situation. "Can I see them?" "Of course," the woman said, leading him down a corridor lined with cages. "The stray is in the kennel area. We haven't named her yet. She's quite a character, very protective of Chance." They stopped in front of a kennel where a medium-sized dog with a brindle coat lay curled up on a blanket. She looked up as they approached, her tail giving a tentative wag. George was struck by her eyes, a deep brown with a hint of sadness and an underlying resilience. "She's beautiful," George murmured, surprised by the emotion in his voice. "She is," the woman agreed, "and incredibly smart." She led the police officer right to Chance. We think she might be a shepherd mix." George knelt by the kennel, cautiously extending his hand. The dog sniffed it cautiously, then licked it with a rough tongue. A warmth spread through George, a feeling he hadn't experienced since Martha's passing. "She seems to like you," the woman said, smiling. "Most people are drawn to Chance, but he's still too weak to interact. She, on the other hand, is ready for a loving home." George looked at the dog, her tail now wagging more confidently. He thought of his empty house, the silent rocking chair, the pervasive loneliness that had become his constant companion. The thought, bold and unexpected, took root in his mind. Can I adopt her?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman's smile widened. "Of course, sir. That would be wonderful." As George filled out the adoption paperwork, a sense of purpose settled over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone anymore. He had a new companion, a furry friend who had shown him the true meaning of loyalty and resilience. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was the beginning of a new chapter in his life. A chapter filled with unexpected joys and second chances. The silence of George's house was shattered. No longer did the ticking clock reign supreme, its monotonous rhythm replaced by the happy click of toenails on hardwood floors and the occasional joyful bark. Hope, true to her name, had brought a whirlwind of energy and life into George's quiet world. The first few days were a whirlwind of adjustments. Housebreaking a dog in his 70s was not something George had ever envisioned. But Hope, with her innate intelligence and eagerness to please, made it surprisingly easy. There were a few mishaps. Of course, a chewed slipper here, a puddle on the rug there, but George found himself chuckling instead of fuming. It seemed Hope had a knack for melting his gruff exterior. He took her for walks in the park, the leash a tangible link between them. He watched, fascinated, as she chased squirrels with abandon, her brindle coat gleaming in the sunlight. He talked to her, sharing stories of his day, his memories of Martha, his hopes and fears. Hope, in turn, listened with rapt attention, her head cocked, her brown eyes filled with unconditional love. He bought her toys, a squeaky bone, a rope for tug-of-war, a plush squirrel that became her favorite. He found himself spending hours at the pet store, overwhelmed by the sheer variety of dog food, treats, and accessories. He even bought her a cozy dog bed, though she preferred to sleep at the foot of his bed, her warm body a comforting presence in the night. Slowly, imperceptibly, George began to change. He started cooking again, simple meals at first, then more elaborate dishes, remembering Martha's recipes and adding his own touches. He rediscovered his love of gardening, tending to his rose bushes with renewed enthusiasm. He even started whistling again, old tunes from his youth that filled the house with a long-forgotten melody. Hope, in turn, thrived under his care. Her coat became glossy, her ribs disappeared, and her eyes sparkled with mischief and joy. She followed him everywhere, her tail wagging constantly, a furry shadow that banished the loneliness that had haunted him for so long. One sunny afternoon, while working in his garden, George felt a familiar pang of grief. He looked at Martha's empty rocking chair, the paint peeling, the cushion faded. A tear rolled down his cheek. "She would have loved Hope," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Suddenly, he felt a wet nose nudge his hand. Hope looked at him, her head tilted, as if sensing his sadness. She whined softly, then licked his hand, her rough tongue a balm to his wounded heart. George knelt down and wrapped his arms around Hope, burying his face in her fur. He cried then, not tears of despair, but tears of gratitude. Hope, his unexpected companion, had shown him that life could still hold joy, that companionship could heal even the deepest wounds. He looked at Hope, her tail wagging excitedly, her eyes shining with love. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "Thank you for finding me." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the garden, George felt a sense of peace he hadn't known since Martha's passing. He wasn't alone anymore. He had Hope, and Hope, it seemed, had him. Life with Hope was a balm to George's soul, a soothing antidote to the loneliness that had consumed him. But as the days turned into weeks, George began to notice certain quirks in Hope's behavior, shadows of a past he could only guess at. Loud noises, like the rumble of a passing truck or the clatter of a dropped pan, would send her cowering under the table, her body trembling, her eyes wide with fear. She was wary of men, especially those wearing hats or uniforms, shrinking away from them with a low growl rumbling in her throat. And at night, she would often wake from nightmares, whimpering and pacing restlessly until George calmed her with soothing words and gentle strokes. These episodes, though infrequent, were a stark reminder of the trauma Hope had endured. George ached to know what horrors she had witnessed, what cruelties had been inflicted upon her and Chance. He imagined her chained in that dark shed, hungry, thirsty, and terrified, her only companion another suffering soul. The thought filled him with rage and a deep sense of injustice. Determined to help Hope overcome her fears, George sought the advice of Dr. Emily Carter, the local veterinarian. Emily, a woman in her late 40s with a warm smile and a gentle touch, had a reputation for her compassion and expertise, especially when it came to animals with troubled pasts. George brought Hope to the clinic, his heart heavy with worry. Emily examined Hope thoroughly, her touch gentle and reassuring. She listened patiently as George described Hope's behavior, nodding understandingly. "It's clear she's been through a lot," Emily said, her voice soft. "But she's also incredibly resilient. She's found a loving home with you, and that's the most important thing." Emily suggested a combination of behavioral therapy and medication to help manage Hope's anxiety. She also recommended regular exercise and playtime to build Hope's confidence and strengthen their bond. "It's a process," Emily explained. "It takes time and patience to heal from trauma, both for humans and animals. But with love and support, Hope can overcome her fears and live a happy, fulfilling life." George left the clinic feeling hopeful. He was grateful for Emily's expertise and her genuine concern for Hope's well-being. He also found himself drawn to her kind eyes and gentle demeanor, a spark of interest igniting within him that he hadn't felt in years. Over the next few weeks, George diligently followed Emily's advice. He took Hope for long walks in the woods, where she could run and explore freely. He played fetch with her in the park, her joyful barks echoing through the trees. He enrolled her in an obedience class where she excelled, her intelligence and eagerness to please shining through. Slowly but surely, Hope began to heal. The nightmares became less frequent, the trembling subsided, and the wary glances turned into trusting gazes. She still had her triggers, but George was there to comfort her, his presence a steady anchor in her stormy sea of memories. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Hope resting her head on George's lap, he looked at her with a newfound appreciation. He saw not just a rescued dog, but a survivor, a testament to the enduring spirit of animals. He stroked her fur, his heart filled with love and admiration. "You're a miracle, Hope," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "A true miracle." Hope, in response, licked his hand, her rough tongue a silent affirmation of their unbreakable bond. In that moment, George knew that he had not only rescued Hope, but she had rescued him, too, painting the town in vibrant hues of green and gold. The trees, bare branches just weeks ago, now burst with new life, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. Flowers bloomed in gardens and window boxes, their sweet fragrance filling the air. The days grew longer, the sun warmer, and a sense of renewal permeated the town. For George and Hope, spring brought a renewed sense of joy and adventure. Their daily walks extended, their playtime in the park more energetic. Hope, now fully recovered from her ordeal, was a picture of health and vitality. Her coat gleamed, her eyes sparkled, and her tail wagged incessantly, a furry metronome keeping time with their happy rhythm. One sunny afternoon, George decided to take Hope to a new walking trail, one that wound through a wooded area along the riverbank. The trail was less crowded than the park, offering a sense of tranquility and solitude. As they strolled along the path, the sunlight filtering through the trees, George felt a sense of contentment he hadn't experienced in years. Suddenly, Hope stopped, her ears perked, her body tense. She let out a low growl, her gaze fixed on something in the distance. George followed her gaze and saw a young boy, no more than 6 years old, standing precariously close to the edge of a steep embankment overlooking the river. The boy, oblivious to the danger, was reaching for a butterfly, his small hand outstretched. George's heart pounded in his chest. One misstep, one gust of wind, and the boy could tumble down the embankment into the rushing water below. "Stay here, Hope," George whispered, his voice urgent. He approached the boy cautiously, not wanting to startle him. "Hey there, young man," George said gently. "That's a beautiful butterfly, but be careful, you're a little too close to the edge." The boy turned, his face lighting up with a smile. "I'm trying to catch it," he said, his voice filled with childish wonder. "I know," George said, keeping his voice calm, "but it's not safe here. Why don't we step back a little and admire it from a safer distance?" The boy hesitated, his eyes still fixed on the butterfly. Just then, a gust of wind swept through the trees, causing the boy to lose his balance. He stumbled, his foot slipping on the loose gravel. George lunged forward, grabbing the boy's arm just as he started to fall. He pulled him back from the edge, his heart pounding in his ears. The boy, startled by his near miss, burst into tears. George knelt down, holding him close, his own fear giving way to relief. "It's okay," he soothed, stroking the boy's hair. "You're safe now." Hope, who had been watching the scene unfold, rushed over, barking excitedly and licking the boy's face. The boy, distracted by the dog's attention, stopped crying and giggled. "What's your name?" George asked, still holding the boy close. "Tommy," the boy replied, sniffling. "Well, Tommy," George said, "I think it's time we found your parents." He led Tommy back to the main trail, Hope trotting alongside them. They soon found Tommy's parents, frantic with worry, searching for their lost son. The reunion was filled with tears of relief and gratitude. Tommy's parents thanked George profusely, their voices choked with emotion. They praised Hope for her alertness, calling her a hero. George, humbled by their gratitude, simply smiled and patted Hope's head. As they walked away, Tommy turned and waved goodbye, his face beaming. "Thank you, Mr. George," he called out. "And thank you, Hope." George watched them go, his heart filled with a warmth that spread through his entire being. He looked at Hope, her tail wagging proudly, her eyes shining with a newfound confidence. "You saved him, Hope," he whispered, his voice filled with pride. "You saved that little boy." Hope, in response, barked happily and nudged his hand, as if to say, "That's what friends do." That day, on the riverbank, George realized that Hope had not only brought joy and companionship into his life, but she had also given him a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just a lonely widower, adrift in a sea of grief. He was a protector, a rescuer, a man with a mission to make the world a better place, one kind act at a time. And by his side, always ready to lend a paw, was his faithful companion, Hope. The incident at the riverbank had a profound impact on George. It wasn't just the adrenaline rush of saving a child, but the realization that Hope, with her heightened senses and unwavering loyalty, had played a crucial role. He started to pay closer attention to her subtle cues, the way her ears would perk up at certain sounds, the way she would sniff the air with a focused intensity. He began to sense that there was more to Hope's story, a hidden chapter waiting to be revealed. One evening, while walking Hope through the town square, George noticed a group of teenagers loitering near the alley where Chance had been found. They were rough-looking boys, their faces etched with a hardness that made George uneasy. He noticed Hope stiffen beside him, her hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in her throat. As they passed the group, George overheard snippets of their conversation. "Stupid dog," one of them muttered, Should've just let him die. Another sneered. George's blood ran cold. He couldn't be sure, but he had a sinking feeling that these boys were somehow connected to Chance's abuse. He quickened his pace, pulling Hope along with him, his heart pounding in his chest. That night, sleep eluded George. He tossed and turned, the boys' cruel words echoing in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that Chance's abusers were still out there, perhaps even planning their next act of cruelty. He felt a surge of protectiveness, not just for Hope, but for all vulnerable creatures. The next morning, George decided to confide in Emily. He drove to the clinic, his mind awhirl with questions and anxieties. Emily listened intently, her brow furrowed with concern. "I'm so sorry, George," she said, her voice filled with compassion. "It's heartbreaking to think that those responsible for Chance's suffering are still out there." "I can't just let it go, Emily," George said, his voice firm. "I have to do something." Emily nodded. "I understand, but be careful, George. These boys sound dangerous." "I will," George assured her. "But I need your help. You treated Chance, you know his injuries. Maybe you can provide some evidence. Something that could link those boys to the abuse." Emily hesitated. "I can't disclose confidential patient information, George, but I can report my suspicions to the authorities. They can investigate further." "Thank you, Emily," George said, relieved. "That's all I ask." Emily reported her concerns to the police, providing them with a detailed account of Chance's injuries. The police, already aware of the case due to Officer Thompson's report, took Emily's information seriously. They launched an investigation, interviewing witnesses and gathering evidence. Meanwhile, George continued to keep a watchful eye on the group of boys, observing their movements, noting their routines. He felt a sense of determination growing within him, a quiet resolve to bring justice for Chance and ensure the safety of other animals. One afternoon, while following the boys at a safe distance, George saw them enter an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. He heard the faint sounds of barking and whimpering coming from inside. His heart sank. He knew he had stumbled upon their cruel playground. He quickly called Emily, informing her of his discovery. Emily, in turn, contacted the police. Within minutes, several police cars arrived at the warehouse. George watched as the officers surrounded the building, their weapons drawn. The raid was swift and decisive. The boys were caught red-handed, abusing another dog. They were arrested and charged with animal cruelty. The rescued dog, a terrified but unharmed terrier mix, was taken to the Havenwood Animal Shelter, where he received the care and attention he desperately needed. News of the arrest spread quickly through Havenwood. The town was outraged by the boys' cruelty. George was hailed as a hero, his courage and determination praised by everyone. He received letters of thanks from concerned citizens, donations to the animal shelter poured in, and the local newspaper ran a front-page story about his bravery. But for George, the greatest reward was seeing the rescued dog wagging its tail, its eyes filled with trust and gratitude. He knew that he had made a difference, that he had helped to protect the innocent and bring justice to the cruel. And he knew that Hope, his loyal companion, had been by his side every step of the way, her presence a constant source of strength and inspiration. The events of the past few weeks had stirred a whirlwind of emotions in George. The fear and anger he felt during the investigation had given way to relief and a sense of justice served. But beneath it all, a quiet hum of something new was vibrating within him, a reawakening, a sense of possibility he hadn't felt since Martha's passing. He found himself seeking out Emily's company, drawn to her warmth, her intelligence, and her shared passion for animal welfare. They would meet for coffee at the local diner, discussing everything from the latest news to their favorite books to the quirks of their animal companions. George found himself looking forward to these meetings, his heart quickening at the sight of her smile, his spirits lifted by her laughter. Emily, too, seemed to enjoy their conversations. She appreciated George's dry wit, his quiet strength, and his newfound dedication to helping animals. She saw in him a kind and compassionate soul, a man who had weathered life's storms with grace and resilience. One evening, after a particularly lively discussion about the upcoming town picnic, George found himself lingering at Emily's doorstep. The setting sun cast a golden glow on her face, highlighting the kindness in her eyes. George stammered, feeling a blush creep up his cheeks. I was wondering if you'd like to, perhaps, join me for dinner sometime. Emily smiled, her eyes twinkling. I'd love to, George. Their first date was a simple affair, a quiet dinner at a cozy Italian restaurant. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and shared memories. George found himself opening up to Emily in a way he hadn't with anyone in years. He spoke of his grief for Martha, his loneliness, and his newfound joy in caring for Hope. Emily listened with empathy and understanding. She shared her own experiences of loss and resilience, her voice soft and reassuring. George felt a connection with her, a sense of kinship that transcended their shared passion for animals. As the weeks turned into months, their relationship blossomed. They went on walks together, explored the local farmers markets, and attended community events. George even started volunteering at the animal shelter, helping Emily with the animals and lending a hand wherever needed. Hope, initially wary of Emily, had grown to adore her. She would greet Emily with enthusiastic tail wags and playful nudges, often vying for her attention. George chuckled at their playful interactions, his heart swelling with a happiness he thought he'd never experience again. But as their bond deepened, George found himself wrestling with a new set of emotions. He felt a growing love for Emily, a love that was different from the deep and abiding love he had shared with Martha. It was a love infused with gratitude, admiration, and a shared passion for life. Yet, a part of him held back, afraid to fully embrace this new happiness. He feared the pain of loss, the vulnerability of opening his heart again. He worried about betraying Martha's memory, about tarnishing the sanctity of their love. One evening, while sitting on his porch with Emily, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, George confessed his fears. I'm afraid, Emily, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Afraid of losing you, afraid of getting hurt again. Emily took his hand, her touch gentle and reassuring. I understand, George. Loss is a part of life, but so is love, and love is worth the risk. Her words resonated with George. He looked at her, her eyes shining with sincerity and affection. He knew she was right. He couldn't let fear dictate his life. He had found a second chance at love, a chance to share his life with someone who understood him, who cherished him, who loved him for who he was. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss filled with tenderness and gratitude. In that moment, under the starlit sky, George let go of his fears and embraced the possibility of a future filled with love, laughter, and the companionship of two extraordinary creatures, Emily and Hope. Summer had reached its peak, blanketing Havenwood in a sweltering heat. The days were long and languid, the air thick with humidity. Evenings offered little respite, the nights warm and restless. George, despite the heat, found himself energized, his life infused with a newfound vibrancy. His relationship with Emily blossomed, their days filled with shared laughter, quiet companionship, and a growing love that warmed his heart like the summer sun. Hope, too, seemed to revel in the joy that surrounded her. She was a constant presence in their lives, joining them on walks, picnics, and even the occasional movie night, curled up at their feet. Her playful spirit and unwavering loyalty were a constant source of amusement and comfort. One stifling afternoon, George decided to take Hope for a swim in the nearby lake. It was a favorite spot of theirs, a secluded cove with a gently sloping beach and cool, clear water. Hope loved to swim, her powerful strokes propelling her through the water with effortless grace. As George settled on the beach, enjoying the shade of a large oak tree, Hope splashed happily in the water, chasing after a floating stick. George watched her with a smile, his heart swelling with pride and affection. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the air, followed by the crashing of branches. George looked up to see a large tree limb falling towards the water, directly in Hope's path. He shouted a warning, his voice filled with panic, but it was too late. The limb crashed into the water, sending a spray of water and debris into the air. Hope disappeared beneath the surface, swallowed by the churning waves. George's heart pounded in his chest. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes frantically searching the water. "Hope!" he yelled, his voice hoarse with fear. "Hope, where are you?" He scanned the water, his heart sinking with each passing second. There was no sign of her. He waded into the water, his clothes clinging to his body, his eyes desperately searching for any movement. "Hope!" he cried again, his voice echoing across the empty lake. He swam out further, his fear growing with each stroke. He dove beneath the surface, his lungs burning, his eyes stinging from the water. But there was nothing, just the murky depths and the eerie silence. He surfaced, gasping for air, his heart heavy with despair. Hope was gone. His loyal companion, his furry savior, had been taken from him in an instant. He swam back to shore, his body trembling with exhaustion and grief. He collapsed on the beach, his sobs echoing through the quiet cove. He had lost Martha, and now he had lost Hope. The pain was unbearable, a crushing weight that threatened to suffocate him. He lay there for what seemed like an eternity, his tears mingling with the sand. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lake, he knew he had to return home, to face the empty house and the silence that awaited him. He drove back to Havenwood, his mind numb with grief. He couldn't bear the thought of entering the house, of facing the empty dog bed and the silent toys. He parked the car and sat there, staring blankly at the steering wheel. Suddenly, a gentle knock on the window startled him. He looked up to see Emily standing beside the car, her face etched with concern. "George," she said softly, her voice filled with worry. "I saw your car. Are you all right?" George couldn't speak. He just shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. Emily opened the car door and knelt beside him, taking his hand in hers. "What's wrong, George? What happened?" He looked at her, his voice choked with emotion. "Hope, she's gone. She drowned." Emily's eyes widened in horror. She pulled him close, holding him tight as he sobbed uncontrollably. She whispered words of comfort, her voice a soothing balm to his wounded heart. She stayed with him that night, holding him, listening to him, sharing his grief. She helped him make phone calls, informing the authorities and the animal shelter of Hope's disappearance. She contacted friends and neighbors, organizing a search party for the following morning. George, lost in his despair, could only cling to Emily's presence, her strength and compassion a lifeline in his sea of sorrow. He knew he couldn't have faced this alone. He was grateful for her love, her unwavering support, her unwavering belief that Hope would be found. Dawn broke over Havenwood, casting a soft glow on the mist-shrouded lake. A small group of volunteers gathered at the cove, their faces etched with concern, their hearts filled with hope. Emily had organized the search party, rallying friends, neighbors, and even strangers to help find Hope. George, his eyes red-rimmed and his face pale, stood by Emily's side, his heart heavy with a mixture of grief and a faint glimmer of hope. He watched as the volunteers spread out along the shoreline, their voices calling out Hope's name, their eyes scanning the water's surface. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher in the sky, the heat growing more intense. The initial optimism began to wane, replaced by a sense of despair. George felt his hope dwindling, the reality of Hope's loss sinking in like a stone in his chest. Just as he was about to give up, a shout echoed across the lake. A young boy, part of the search party, was pointing excitedly towards a cluster of reeds on the far side of the cove. "There! I saw something move!" he yelled. A surge of adrenaline coursed through George. He rushed towards the reeds, his heart pounding in his chest. He pushed through the thick foliage, his eyes scanning the ground. And there she was, Hope, lying curled up in a small clearing, her fur matted and damp, her body shivering. She looked up at George, her eyes weak but filled with recognition. "Hope!" George cried, his voice breaking with emotion. He knelt beside her, gathering her into his arms. She whimpered softly, licking his face with a weak tongue. He held her close, burying his face in her fur, tears of relief streaming down his cheeks. She was alive. Against all odds, she had survived. He carried her back to the group, a wave of cheers and applause erupting as they saw her. Emily rushed towards him, her eyes shining with joy. "She's alive!" she exclaimed, embracing him tightly. "Oh, George, I'm so happy." Hope was taken to Emily's clinic, where she received a thorough examination. She was weak and dehydrated, but otherwise unharmed. Emily explained that she had likely been swept away by the current and managed to find her way to the shore, where she had sought shelter in the reeds. George stayed by Hope's side throughout the day, watching as she slowly regained her strength. He fed her small amounts of food and water, spoke to her in soothing tones, and stroked her fur gently. He couldn't bear to leave her side, his fear of losing her again still fresh in his mind. As evening approached, Hope was strong enough to return home. George carried her into the house, placing her gently on her dog bed. She curled up, her eyes closing contentedly. George and Emily sat beside her, watching her sleep. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices filled with gratitude and relief. "I thought I'd lost her," George confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I'd lost everything." Emily took his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "You have me, George, and you have hope. You're not alone." He looked at her, his heart filled with love and appreciation. He had found a second chance at happiness, a happiness that had been forged through loss, resilience, and the unwavering love of a dog named Hope. The next morning, George woke to the sound of Hope's happy barks. He opened his eyes to see her standing by the bed, her tail wagging excitedly. She looked at him, her eyes shining with her usual playful spirit. He smiled, his heart overflowing with joy. He had faced the darkness, and he had emerged stronger, his life enriched by the love of two extraordinary creatures. He knew that the future held uncertainties, but he also knew that he would face them with courage, with hope, and with the unwavering support of his beloved companions. As the sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow on the room, George felt a sense of peace and contentment he hadn't known in years. He had found his way back from the depths of despair, guided by the light of hope, the unwavering loyalty of a dog, and the enduring power of love.